Welcome to today's video, where we'll be exploring one of the most pressing and potentially catastrophic topics of our time, World War III. As global tensions continue to rise, the threat of a major conflict is no longer just a theoretical idea. It's a real and imminent possibility that could shape the future of the world. But today, we won't just be talking about the political or military implications. We'll be diving deep into the economic consequences of such a war, especially focusing on how it could affect your daily life. In a world that's already facing economic challenges, understanding the potential financial impact of global warfare is more important than ever. Think about it. If war were to break out on a global scale, how would it affect you? It's easy to imagine the obvious disruptions, such as conflict zones, refugee crises, and military actions. But what about the more subtle, yet far-reaching, consequences? The global economy is already fragile, with supply chain disruptions, inflation, and rising energy prices. Now, consider those issues being magnified in the midst of war. World War III would not only destabilize political systems but could send shockwaves through the global market, affecting everything from your paycheck to the price of food. This video will break down these complex factors and explain why we must understand the full scope of what a world war could mean for the global economy. At the heart of the world economy is trade. Today, the global market is interconnected, with countries relying on one another for essential goods, raw materials, and technology. The outbreak of World War III could cause massive disruptions to these global supply chains, affecting industries from tech to agriculture. Countries that are central to global trade, such as China, India, the United States, and the EU, could face direct attacks or crippling sanctions. These trade interruptions could lead to price hikes on goods, severe shortages, and long-lasting effects on the availability of essential products. From electronics to food, the everyday items we rely on could become increasingly difficult to obtain, and their prices could soar beyond what many can afford. Markets. As geopolitical tensions rise, fear would take over the markets, triggering panic selling. Investors would flee to safer assets like gold, while stock prices could plummet across the board. This would lead to a significant loss of wealth for individuals, pension funds, and businesses alike. The consequences could be particularly devastating for average citizens, as the value of their savings and investments could diminish rapidly. For those who rely on the stock market for future financial security, such a downturn could mean years of recovery, or even permanent loss. It would be a financial crisis unlike anything we've seen before, affecting not only the wealthiest but also those who depend on financial stability. In the midst of such economic turmoil, the world could also face hyperinflation. As governments scramble to fund military operations, they may be forced to print massive amounts of money. While this could initially seem like a solution, it often leads to currency devaluation. A currency losing its value means that goods and services become more expensive, while wages remain stagnant or decline. Imagine your monthly expenses doubling or tripling without any increase in your income. This phenomenon has already been seen in other countries during times of war and financial collapse. For the average person, this could mean skyrocketing prices on basic necessities like food, fuel, and healthcare. The very foundation of financial stability could crumble, leaving millions struggling to survive in a rapidly shifting economy. One of the most pressing issues during any global conflict is the energy crisis. In the case of World War III, energy supplies could become one of the primary targets. Major oil-producing regions, such as the Middle East, could be directly impacted, leading to a sudden shortage of fuel. This would have far-reaching consequences on daily life, as energy is essential not just for transportation but for manufacturing, heating, and electricity. As demand outpaces supply, the cost of energy would skyrocket, and nations would be forced to ration resources. This would place an unbearable burden on both individuals and businesses, making it even more difficult for the average person to afford basic services. The economic impact would extend well beyond just fuel prices. Industries that rely heavily on energy, like manufacturing and transportation, would see their costs rise dramatically, leading to a slowdown in production and possibly even the collapse of certain sectors. Alongside energy disruptions, food security would become another major challenge. Global conflicts often disrupt agricultural production and distribution. The world depends heavily on certain regions for food supplies, such as wheat from Ukraine or rice from Southeast Asia. A prolonged war would cause significant crop failures, or worse, prevent these countries from exporting their harvests. As food shortages deepen, prices would rise sharply, leaving many unable to afford basic nutrition. The strain on global food systems would be exacerbated by the collapsing infrastructure in conflict zones, which would make transporting food more difficult. This could lead to widespread famine in certain parts of the world, especially in developing nations where access to food is already limited. The long-term consequences could mean a dramatic rise in global hunger, leading to an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. In addition to the immediate scarcity of goods, we could see a rise in black markets and underground economies. As governments struggle to maintain control over essential goods, they might impose strict regulations and rationing. But where there is demand, there will also be supply, even if it's illegal. Black markets could flourish, with people resorting to purchasing goods at inflated prices, bypassing official channels. While this might seem like an opportunity for some to profit, it also leads to increased crime and corruption. In conflict zones, this can make it difficult for individuals to access necessities like food, medicine, and even clean water. Moreover, it could trigger a rise in illegal trade, including weapons and stolen goods, further destabilizing already vulnerable economies. The economic impact of World War III would not be felt equally across the globe. Developing nations, which are already struggling with financial instability, would suffer the most. Many of these countries are dependent on exports, and disruptions in global trade would send their economies into freefall. For example, countries in Africa or Southeast Asia rely on exports of raw materials or agricultural products. A breakdown in the global supply chain would force these nations to either significantly reduce their production or accept drastically lower prices for their goods. Meanwhile, inflation would spike, making everything more expensive. Basic commodities like food, healthcare, and energy would become out of reach for millions of people. These regions, often the most vulnerable, could face not only economic collapse but also long-term setbacks in development, pushing them further away from recovery. Another pressing concern is the role of technology in modern warfare. In today's world, technology is at the core of most economies, but it's also the primary tool in conflicts. In a global war, cyber warfare could target critical infrastructure like banking systems, financial markets, and communication networks. Imagine waking up to find that your bank account is inaccessible or that you can no longer make online payments. The cybersecurity risks would be enormous, with nations fighting for control over information and resources. A cyber attack could cause chaos in global markets, disrupting everything from financial transactions to supply chain management. With digital transactions now a primary form of business, the vulnerability of these systems means that a single successful cyber attack could trigger a financial crisis on a global scale. The financial ramifications of this could last for years, long after the conflict ends. In the aftermath of a global conflict, the effects on developing economies would be particularly devastating. These nations are often highly dependent on global trade, and any disruption to the global supply chain could send their economies into a downward spiral. For example, many countries in Africa and Southeast Asia rely on exporting raw materials, agricultural products, or textiles to wealthier nations. If World War III causes trade routes to close or resources to be diverted to support military operations, these countries may be unable to export their goods, or they may face a sharp drop in demand. Additionally, global inflation would further compound the problem, pushing the cost of essential goods like food and medicine beyond reach. This would lead to rising poverty levels and a potential humanitarian crisis as developing nations struggle to meet their basic needs. The military-industrial complex would see massive growth during a global conflict, as governments around the world would be forced to increase defense spending exponentially. The need for weapons, ammunition, and technology would drive demand in defense sectors. But while this may seem like an economic boon for arms manufacturers, the benefits would not be felt by the general public. Increased military spending typically comes at the expense of social programs, healthcare, education, and infrastructure. In nations that are already financially strained, this reallocation of resources would deepen inequality, as people would see fewer investments in public services. The funds directed towards military expansion could have been used for rebuilding critical infrastructure or investing in innovation, but instead, these resources would go towards sustaining the war effort, leaving many without the basic services they need to thrive. Furthermore, cyber warfare would play a key role in the economic fallout. Modern economies are deeply dependent on the internet and digital networks, and in the case of a world war, cyber attacks would be one of the first lines of defense. Critical infrastructure, such as financial systems, energy grids, and government services, could be targeted. A successful cyber attack on a country's banking system could freeze financial transactions, causing widespread panic. For businesses, this could mean an inability to make payments, access capital, or keep track of their finances. Consumers, too, would be affected, as everyday transactions might become impossible. The global economy relies on the smooth functioning of digital systems, and any disruption to these systems would have long-lasting economic consequences that could last well beyond the end of the war itself. In addition to digital warfare, the collapse of global supply chains would have long-term economic effects. Even after the cessation of hostilities, it would take years for the world's supply chains to recover. The logistical infrastructure that allows goods to be manufactured, shipped, and distributed worldwide would be severely impacted. Ports, railways, and factories in conflict zones could be destroyed, leading to a backlog of products that cannot reach markets. The cost of rebuilding these supply networks would be astronomical, and the time it takes to get them back up and running could mean years of economic stagnation. For consumers, this would mean continued shortages of goods and services, which would keep prices high and create long-term economic instability. As the global economy grapples with these challenges, wealth inequality would likely widen even further. The wealthiest individuals and corporations are often in a better position to weather economic storms, particularly in times of conflict. They can move their assets to safer investments, such as gold or foreign currency, or even profit from the war itself by supplying goods and services to military forces. On the other hand, the middle and lower classes would bear the brunt of the economic collapse. Job losses, rising costs, and inflation would force many families into poverty, while the rich would become even wealthier. This growing divide could lead to social unrest, as the disadvantaged populations, already struggling with the economic fallout, demand a more equitable distribution of resources. After the immediate effects of a global conflict, one of the most significant economic challenges will be the long-term depression that follows. Once the war subsides, the global economy would likely face a prolonged period of stagnation. With nations focused on rebuilding, it would take years, if not decades, for economies to recover. Governments would be forced to allocate significant portions of their budgets to reconstruction, which would leave little room for investment in other sectors like education, healthcare, or innovation. For businesses, the uncertainty created by years of conflict would hinder growth, as investment in long-term projects would become too risky. For individuals, the fear of further instability could lead to lower consumer confidence and reduced spending, further stalling economic recovery. This economic depression would not be felt equally across the world. Countries that were already economically vulnerable would find it particularly difficult to recover. Developing nations, in particular, would face a more severe uphill battle. Many of these countries rely heavily on exports or foreign investment, both of which would be severely reduced during and after a global conflict. The cost of borrowing would rise sharply, and access to financial resources would become scarce. Without a robust economic foundation to begin with, these nations would struggle to rebuild their infrastructure, industries, and social services, potentially leaving them in a cycle of poverty and underdevelopment for years to come. However, rebuilding efforts would also offer some opportunities. International aid organizations, governments, and private businesses would likely rally together to help reconstruct war-torn regions. The rebuilding process could spark new economic growth in certain areas, particularly in sectors like construction, energy, and technology. But this recovery would be uneven, and the progress made by wealthier nations could leave developing regions behind. While there may be short-term economic booms in countries involved in rebuilding efforts, the overall balance of economic power could shift, with new economic superpowers emerging while others struggle to regain their footing. On a global scale, restructuring the international economy could be inevitable. After such a conflict, the current financial systems and trade networks may no longer be sustainable. New economic structures could emerge, perhaps even involving digital currencies or new global financial institutions. Traditional banks and governments might no longer have the same level of influence, as countries look for new ways to rebuild and safeguard their economic interests. While some see this as an opportunity for innovation, others fear that the restructuring could lead to greater inequality. For individuals, the introduction of new systems could create confusion and instability as they navigate the new economic landscape. Finally, as we consider the broader global impact, it's important to note that preparing for the economic consequences of a global conflict is crucial. While we can't predict exactly what will happen, understanding the potential fallout helps us make informed decisions about how to protect ourselves and our families. From diversifying investments to adjusting our personal finances, there are steps we can take to mitigate the risks. However, even with preparation, the long-term effects of a world war would be far-reaching, and it's essential to stay informed and adapt to a constantly changing global economy. In times of uncertainty, knowledge is power, and staying prepared could make all the difference in weathering the storm.